It has come to my attention that apparently Volcarona is broken in Generation 9. Wow, that's shocking. One of the most insanely busted setup sweepers of all time is able to change its type. And yeah, no, that sounds reasonable. But I don't even know if the Volk broken in Gen 9 thing is true. I don't know if it's the consensus or if it's just a couple people being loud or what. I just heard of this last night. But more than the specifics of Volcarona's potential brokenness in Gen 9, it got me thinking about the arguably fundamental broken aspect of Volcarona that has been inherent to it ever since it came out in Generation 5, before it was even named Volcarona, when it was still named Urugamosu, and it didn't use Quiver Dance, it used Butterfly Dance. I had to sneak that in there. Yeah, I was around on day 1 of Generation 5, haven't you heard? Um, but it has been frustrating people to ever since that day one. I think I forget who it was that made a video with it, like on like the second day of Gen 5. I think it was Shofu who had like a Wi-Fi battle where Volcarona just let off and used Urigamusu let off and used Butterfly Dance and then swept everything because it was unprecedented at the time. I mean, being able to boost 3 different stats like, simultaneously—that's ridiculous. I mean, it'd be scary enough if it was just a special Dragon Dance, but the fact that it boosts its special defense as well, so it's a Calm Mind and a special Dragon Dance at the same time, that makes it even more ridiculous to deal with because it takes away a revenge killing option. So, not only does it take away a revenge killing option, it makes setting up even easier because you can set up in the face of things like Scald that would otherwise hit it pretty hard. So, Volcarona has been polarizing ever since then because it has consistently created games like the one in the replay you just saw where the game is like instantly over because what are you going to do? Run 6 Pokemon that don't give Volcarona any setup? No, you're not. I mean, you could, but then you would be getting destroyed by other Pokemon. Like, to use the case of Gen 5, Volcarona sets up on Steel types, right? So what are you going to not run Steel types? Okay, then enjoy losing to all the dragons in the tier. And that's the fundamental idea of Volcarona, is that it preys on these kind of team building necessities inherent in the metagame and has a very restricted pool of true answers. Now, Pokemon that are difficult to check or counter are nothing new, even by the time Gen 5 came around. Gen 4 was particularly tumultuous in that regard. But Volcarona ushered in a new era of Extreme because it's so much harder to play around than anything you've seen before, and really in ways that are still difficult to match to this day. Okay, the thing with Volcarona is that either it wins like immediately or it has games like this, one of my favorite battles of all time, in which it does nothing. And that's why people call it the matchup moth. It's got a lot of significant weak points. Yes, of course, like pre-heavy duty boots, that it was always the stealth rock issue. And the fact that it's really physically frail, and that its typing is actually pretty interesting defensively, but it's not exactly loaded enough for it to get a ton of switch-in opportunities. But then, like, all those weak points are drowned out by how completely it dominates teams that are otherwise very good. It's not like it only beats bad teams. It's more that these teams are able to handle much of pretty much everything in the metagame, and then Volcarona comes around and destroys them. It's very difficult to be safe against it because even its checks, it can turn the tables on without doing much necessarily. Because I'm not talking like extreme nonsense to get past checks. Like Choice Band Volcarona Flare Blitzes Blissey and Blissey dies, so therefore Volcarona can do anything. No, not like that. I mean like a little tweak to its coverage. Like the difference between Fire, Bug, and Giga Drain, and then Hidden Power Ground over Giga Drain is all the difference in the world. And it's Volcarona perfectly encompasses that kind of struggle to cover everything in the metagame, where it's not that the team that struggles to handle Volcarona is being lazy, it's that well, I want to check everything else in the metagame to such an extent that I feel safe against it, but that's going to leave me more vulnerable against Volcarona. And even if I do use a foolproof check, let's just call things like Scarf Garchomp a foolproof check, then it's going to make me much worse against other styles in the metagame. And Volcarona's power is such, not that it sweeps at the drop of a hat against a lot of teams, but that it it does force this kind of team building conundrum that has been more and more prevalent as the generations go on and more threats get added. I mean, this is not something unique to Volcarona, of course. All sorts of threats come together and make it tough to deal with the metagame. Because Volcarona is not always, or often, it's not even like in the top 5 or whatever metagame defining threats. Specifically because it's really hard to use sometimes. I mean, that Stealth Rock weakness, I mean, look at great timing right now. Like, Volcarona's use in this battle is switching into a U-turn from Scizor with Rock, so it doesn't even get Flame Body. Oh yeah, I've seen some dumb Flame Body stuff Volcarona, from Volcarona before, but that's not really here nor there. It's more that, and this is why I wanted to make this video, because Volcarona's matchup forcing is so extreme that it kind of encompasses the philosophical aspect of tiering. Like, do we want such extreme Pokemon in the game? Because Volcarona does not really add much defensively to the game, to the generation it's in. Actually, I somewhat take that back for something like Gen 8 or 9, because I didn't really play Gen 8 after a while, but I do know that for a while, Volcarona was one of the few Pokemon capable of checking Kyurem, which was insanely broken. Of course, then Kyurem used Specs Draco Meteor, but that was because Kyurem was broken. So, like, in newer gens with heavy-duty boots, then it's something else. That Volcarona is, and I think in Gen 9 people have been using Volcarona defensively. Okay, sure. But Gens 5 through 7, it's like, nah, this thing is here to sweep. And it's not going to really do much. I mean, people tried bulky Volcarona, but they were like, this thing is hit not just by stealth. I mean, Talonflame in Gen 6 is hit just by Stealth Rock, but Volcarona is hit on by spikes and toxic spikes on top of that. So it really is that Pokemon that you build entire teams around. I mean, look at Smurf's team here. It's like, yeah, okay, there's Cress, and but it's mostly everything for Volcarona. Or Smurf's more famous Gen 5 team, of course, is Garchomp, Volcarona, Dragonite, Starmie, Breloom, Scizor, or just all-out hyper offense. And most of that team's strength comes from Volcarona just blasting its way through entire teams. Because only Sun teams, when Dugtrio was allowed, could commit to so thoroughly supporting Volk like this. Everything else that Volk fits on, and something like Gens 5, 6, 7, then it's really just there. You're not saying, oh, I'm going to break down the Volcarona counters and then I'm going to sweep with it, because it doesn't really work like that. It's not really part of the combined efforts of your team, because you could have, you could wear down the true Volcarona check, like Gen 5 Sand Terrakion, putting aside how hard that is to lure, because Terrak doesn't switch into much else besides Volk. But just for example's sake, let's say I'm going to wear down the Garchomp or the Dragonite and the Terrakion, and then I'm going to sweep with my Volcarona. Well, it doesn't really work like that, because Volcarona sometimes, even when it doesn't have any true checks on the field, then it's still not going to be able to set up and sweep, because so much hits it hard. I mean, it can't even safely set up on something like Skarmory, because it gets Brave Birded. That's if Skarmory's Sturdy isn't active, and if Sturdy isn't active, then Skarmory becomes a check to Volcarona. So silly stuff like that. And yes, there are ways to revenge kill it. CB D-Knight takes its hits and has E-Speed for good measure. Scarf Garchomp became really popular in 2016. I made a whole video about why Scarf Garchomp was so great, actually, in Gen 5, if you want to go check that one out. But the pool of Pokemon that checks Volcarona, like, truly is just so low, and they come with their own limitations, and those limitations are then exploitable. Like, if you can say on a team like Smurfs, for most Pokemon, oh, if my opponent has a good Volcarona check, then I'm going to abuse it in so-and-so way. And the problem with Volcarona, in theory, is that it is too extreme in this regard. Because trying to divide your matchups so that if your opponent has so-and-so check to this Pokemon, then you're going to capitalize elsewhere, that's fine. But with Volcarona, and Volcarona is not the only such culprit. Oh, look at that damage. In Gen 5 or Gen 6 or Gen 7, or arguably Gen 8, then yes, it's not the only culprit, but the rewards are too huge because of its insane power and that great speed tier. And I mean, even things like Scarf Keldeo sometimes struggled to check Volcarona because because of the special defense boost. So it's like little things like that which you don't really think, oh, this is part of it, and then you realize, yeah, it is part of it. So, is Smurf gonna rest here? No, he's not. Anyway, so it's less of a, is Volcarona truly broken, because people say, oh, just, get up Stealth Rock. I even saw some people saying Volcarona was annoying in Gen 8, because, yeah, Heatran is there, and there's no Dugtrio or Hidden Power Ground, but, there's no Dugtrio or Hidden Power Ground, but the problem lies in that Heatran really wants to use, there is Heatran and no Hidden Power Ground, excuse me. There is Heatran, but it really wants to use Flame Body for all the U-turns and things like Weavile. And if it doesn't use Flame Body, if it does use Flame Body, then it ceases to be a check to Volcarona. So even when Volcarona is at its most neutered, in terms of HP Ground at least, or any sort of hidden power, then it still manages to pose a really obnoxious team-building contrivance. So yeah, that's really the root of the issue. Not so much Volk itself. And this used to be like an unfathomable thing. Like in Gen 5, it was like, is the Pokemon broken or not? But now it's like, no, it's more about the effect. Kyurem Black actually has had a similar argument made for it in Gen 5. It's like, nobody could actually argue that KB is broken in Gen 5, but it really doesn't add anything. Like, it's not a good defensive Pokemon. It just adds another uncounterable monster to the tier and makes team building harder, and and punishes teams that want to play it safe. Now, I'm not advocating for teams that should never be able to be punished, because if that was the case, we would be playing a very stupid and pointless game, but which we are not. But I get the argument. It's like, oh, I'm trying to cover everything, and then here's this dumb, uncounterable, or, Pokemon, or a very difficult to counter Pokemon that really forces me to go out of my way and be worse off. Like the classic example for KB is, if you use specially defensive Jirachi over Heatran on your old age Gen 5 stall team, then you're fine. But as soon as you switch Heatran out for Jirachi, you become so much worse against so many other things. And it's really only just for that one busted Pokemon that you're making that change. And some would argue that's an unhealthy effect to have in a metagame. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that Volcarona is inherently like something you don't want to have in the game, but I definitely sympathize with the arguments, because it is kind of silly if we're promoting a competitive metagame. And I don't think Volcarona is like anywhere near the most fundamentally ban-worthy thing in Gen 5, not by a long shot. But it's more about the type of Pokemon that Volcarona is the most iconic example of, that have been popping up in greater and greater volume since Gen 5, with other moves like Shell Smash. So yeah, I mean, people were saying when gems were banned, it's like, oh, now Volcarona is palatable in Gen 5, now that it can't bug buzz its way past T-Tar. And then you think about it, and you're like, yeah, so the best check most people, or most teams, can muster to Volcarona is a Pokemon weak to one of its stabs. And you better keep it at, like, full health, or goodbye. Now, obviously, this is... I mean, if you've been listening, then you know I'm not saying Volcarona is an unstoppable beast that needs to be axed immediately. Because, yes, it has plenty of flaws. It's very frail and all that. But Yeah, it's more that kind of turning the game into extremes, really taking the game out of. I'm not gonna say Volcarona takes the game entirely out of players' hands because that's silly, but it's more that Volcarona. I don't even want to say that it encourages skillless play. It's just less about player interaction. Okay, there are definitely games where Volcarona can encourage very skillful play to play around it, but that's true of a lot of broken Pokemon. Like when Dugtrio was running around in several gens, like, oh, that player made a really great play to play around the threat of Dugtrio. That doesn't mean that Dugtrio wasn't broken. Or one of the best games I've ever seen in early Gen 5 on Pokemon Online, when the Smogon server wasn't active, it was down for one reason or another, then we would have to go play on the main server, the PO server. And PO took a while to ban Drizzle Swim. So we would just be laddering with our standard teams, not equipped for Drizzle Swim. And once my buddy Roscoe got a game, and he ran into Drizzle Swim with a team completely unprepared for it. And to this day, the game he played to play around it, because it was like a good player too. It was like near the top of the ladder, and he managed to play around it. It was unbelievable. I still can't believe he pulled it off 12 years later. Something like that. But yeah, that doesn't mean that Drizzle Swim wasn't insanely broken. God, I wish I had the log of that. It was really incredible. So basically the idea is that with Volcarona, I say all that to say that Volcarona doesn't necessarily take skill out of the game, but it does definitely lead to scenarios where it's less about I'm going to not even necessarily outscale my opponent, but I'm not going to maneuver around my opponent as much because I have this big setup button that just kind of blows over the entire metagame. I know people have had similar sentiments about Shift Gear Magearna in Gen 7 at certain times. Where it's like, I remember in particular talking to Blunder at one point. I was like, how do you feel about Gen 7? He's like, I feel like so much of the game is just pointless because you're just waiting for Magearna to come in and set up. And that's that. Everything else doesn't matter because it just destroys everything. So, yeah, and I don't know that Magearna is that extreme. I don't think anyone would want to ban Magearna now. But Volcarona kind of follows a similar idea a lot of the time, where it's just like, yeah, well, if my opponent has the tool, it's kind of like Baton Pass. It's like, oh, well, I'm not going to really do much with it. I'm just going to hope my opponent doesn't have the tools to deal with it. And if they do, then I'm not going to be doing much with this thing. It's not like I can outmaneuver it, really. It's just I hope they can't deal with it, and I'm going to bowl them over, and yeah, simple as. Like, if we go back to the Tsung game as the first example, like, Sweeper's team was fine. It's just, oh, Volcarona comes in on Ferrothorn, and clicks Quiver Dance very, very safely, and that's kind of that. And to incorporate Volcarona check, it just encourages a lot of, not necessarily guesswork, but yeah, I mean, there are definitely some players who like refuse to check Volk ever just because they're like, oh, this is so unreasonable, I'm not going to face it anyway, and that leads to dumb stuff, obviously. But the dance to try and cover everything in the metagame has been more and more precarious for the last, like, decade plus. And Volcarona's extremes, I mean, we see it in, like, Gen 6, too. A lot of people hated Volk in Gen 6 in particular because, like, all the Scarfers faster than it are bad. Like, Latios is the only half-decent one, and that has to use Psyshock to hit it. And putting aside that, it's like, yeah, you gotta... Yeah, it's not something you really love to have in a metagame. So, and then, like, with screens, obviously, it gets even nastier alongside another Destroy of Worlds Manaphy. Like, which also, in Gen 3, because in Gen 2, Tailglow was just Nasty Plot. In Gen 5 is when it got buffed to +3 in a single stat. So that's another example of the, like, super extreme boosting setup sweepers. And I've talked to Peng about this in particular. He's like, yeah, once you boost more than two stats at a time, or you get like, once you get more than +2 in a turn, then like whether it's +2 in one stat or +1/+1 in another stat, that's when things kind of start not going wrong necessarily. Because I think there have been plenty of great metagames with Volcarona in it. It's just the question is, would this be better without Volcarona? Is it really adding anything positive other than, because it's not like, yeah, the whole skillful use thing. Anyway, that's pretty much all I wanted to say and foster discussion and all that other stuff. Whether it's metagame specific or a more fundamental philosophical question of Pokemon tiering and its competitive aims and whatnot. So, thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and I will catch you in the next one.